Imagine a woman who has endured emotional, physical, or sexual abuse for years. Her husband has isolated her from family and friends, restricted her finances, and harms her every day. If this woman then physically hurts her partner, is she seen as abusive? How do we address this woman's use of force, recognizing that she has a survivorship history? Could she enter an abuse intervention program designed for men? Or do we have to address women's use of force in a fundamentally different way? This is Unsilenced, a JBWS podcast where we have real conversations about abuse. I'm MC Robinson, and today we're releasing an episode I recorded several weeks ago with
Lisa Young Larance.
She's been a social work practitioner for many years, and more recently, she's become an assistant professor of social work at the Graduate School of Social Work and Social Research at Bryn Mawr. Dr. Lisa Young Larance is a pioneer in the field of anti-violence intervention. Her book, Broken: Women's Stories of Intimate and Institutional Harm and Repair, was published in August of last year and illuminates the issue with the victim-offender binary through real stories. Dr. Young Larance was also instrumental in developing JBWS's VISTA program in the early 2000s, which was designed to address women's use of abuse in their relationships. In this episode, Dr. Young Larance examines the issue with the victim offender binary. She explains why programs designed for men who have used abuse will not work for women due to differences in socialization. Dr. Young Larance also offers insights into how society perceives victims of abuse who harm their partners. But before you listen, please take a moment to subscribe to Unsilenced wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to break the silence around domestic violence. Before we start this conversation, how do we talk about these gendered types of experiences without feeding into stereotypes? Like, women are always X, men are always Y, people present in these
Mhm.
ways. And I kind of liked how you kind of like addressed how do we keep that in mind as we have a very kind of gendered discussion today?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. I think we need to go back, take a few steps back, and ask who are the people in the room? At that time, it was cisgender women, primarily in heterosexual relationships, who
Mhm.
were being arrested. And some of them, it was inappropriate arrest, wrongfully arrested. It shouldn't have happened. Other women absolutely had histories of domestic and sexual violence, and they were breaking the law. In the book that you mentioned, Broken: Women's Stories of Intimate and Institutional Harm, I explain that we don't want to replicate this idea of like the deserving victim and the vilified offender.
Mhm.
We want to think again, who is in the room and what is our role and goal? And as a social worker, both a social work practitioner and a social work researcher in this area, my goal is to end violence in intimate relationships, whatever the identities of the people are and the experiences that they are having. Now, I see my systems partners. I do see police, judges, probation, child protection. I believe that we ideally are partners in this movement and this effort. And I believe that we all have the ultimate goal of ending that violence. But our role in that is very different. And that is oftentimes where there's a lot of opportunity for deeper understanding.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
it's really interesting because as you talk about this and from what I've read in your book, I think you do a great job of really explaining this. So, why would you say it is like so critically important to approach women who use force differently than men who use force or abuse in their relationships?
I think we need to take a step back and perhaps rephrase the question with a
Sure.
historical perspective. Yeah. So when we think of the battered women's movement in the 60s and 70s, which was absolutely fundamental in the US setting of bringing a problem that was seen as a private family problem to a public problem. That was a major accomplishment of the battered women's movement.
Mm-hmm.
With that came different ways and ideas around handling that and addressing that.
Mhm.
And it largely depended on who was in leadership. There were many middle-class white cisgender women in the leadership. And there was choices made around alliances with the legal system.
Mhm.
And there is critique now about some of those choices that were made. But I think it's that's the benefit of hindsight. But at the time, that those decisions saved lives and
Mhm.
were crucial to laying the groundwork for formal responses. One of those formal responses was that shelters for survivors, who were mainly women, were institutionalized and started receiving public funding and federal funding. With that work, when we think of, for example, Transition House, which is in Cambridge, Massachusetts, one of the first shelters, not the first, but one of the earliest shelters in the US, and the formality that came with that, their leadership then guided David Adams' work with the Emerge program. So the Emerge was the first program in the US that addressed men's abuse of women, men's violence against women, cisgender men's violence against cisgender women. Okay, so depending upon how detailed we want to get here, but all of that is important.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then when we think of that binary again, as I was explaining with the funding, being in the survivor support setting, funding is for survivor support, and there's historically been ideas of how we think of survivors. Now, when we think of that early battering intervention, so BIP or battering intervention program, the first in US, the Emerge program, that was created again to serve men who harm their partners, and shelters were for women. So shelters were confidential spaces that were free of charge. Battering intervention are fee for service, and they're not confidential. They're surveilled by the legal system, by a probation officer.
Right.
So that became the framework for how you address violence in intimate relationships, men's violence against women. So when women started getting arrested, practitioners often had to scramble to think, well, what do we do? We're getting these orders from judges around what do we do? And there's little funding, there's little time. Oftentimes, there's very little support from the community of what to do. So many programs did what felt like it made sense at the time, was change the pronouns. Okay, so instead of a men's program, we now have a women's program. Okay, we're good to go. We can now address women's use of force and
Right.
men's battering behavior, because battering is a gendered and it is a historical gendered term to refer to men's violence against women.
Okay.
Okay. So with that, then that became the framework.
Mm.
Women receive supportive survivor services, men receive battering intervention. Oh, but wait, when women started getting arrested, the box, if we want to think of it as like a one size fits all approach, was that battering intervention program. So then agencies started calling it women's battering intervention, which is actually a misnomer. It's a contradiction. This
That-
binary of women, men, and the differences, it was actually all melded together. When
Mhm.
we know that battering intervention, the Emerge program, the Duluth program, and many amazing programs around the nation and now around the world were created to address how many men, are socialized and the message that they get about masculinity
Right.
and what supports men's violence structurally against women for
Mm.
men of many different backgrounds. And there are ongoing conversations around, do you have, Oliver Williams has done amazing work with African American men in groups and having separate groups for African American men. And there's other work done to parse out different identities and how that makes sense. Okay, that's from a social work and advocate activist perspective of what intervention providers were doing. But the legal system saw survivor support, battering intervention. Survivors are harmed, battering intervention is for people who've harmed. All right, one size fit. We have a place to send people,
Mhm.
not understanding that when an intervention, regardless of what it is created, ideally, hopefully, it is created through research and deep understanding of the presenting behaviors and challenges of a certain population.
Right.
So putting women in a group that was created to address men's socialized behaviors was actually re-victimizing for
Yeah.
many.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, it continues to happen. But we are also at a very early stage of this, and we must continue to have conversations around what are the best possible innovations to meet people where they are. And how do people feel comfortable with both compassionate confrontation and opportunities to heal and move forward? Because I firmly believe that in pushing beyond that binary, both in the binary and how we see services and how we see people, we've got to show up for people to understand and address the harm caused as well as the harm experienced. So there's a lot of work to do in that area.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you're saying basically the term batterers was intended to be applied to men, and so you're slapping the female label onto that, and it's like, oh, it's the same thing. Like, why won't this work? But trying to kind of force women into a program that wasn't really designed with them in mind, I would imagine would be very difficult. So, would you go into this a little bit more about why these abuse intervention programs that are designed or were designed predominantly originally for men not really work for women and how it could really even lead to re-victimizing them?
Mhm. Well, in general, recognizing that when a battering intervention program is designed to address men's power and control in a patriarchal society,
Right.
there are dynamics and interventions that are tailored to that population. So if you have women receiving these same messages and they think, wait, I haven't had that experience, that gendered experience,
Right.
how does this apply to me? Or the challenge too is in the hundreds of people that I've met with over the years, oftentimes men who hold the coercive control in the relationship do not take responsibility for the harm caused over an extended period of time. Yes, there's always opportunities for change, always. Women who've harmed their partners typically call for an intake taking responsibility. It's that shame and that self-blame. They've been socialized very differently around what's okay.
Wow.
Yes, yes. And it is a very different dynamic. And again, I don't want to replicate this binary by talking about men and women.
Yeah.
Uh, but this is where we are now in this moment. And I believe there's amazing work being done for people in same-sex relationships, people of a range with a range of identities. But to answer that question again, like why would a program that's created for men not work for women? Well, it's a different population, different needs. And when women are coming taking responsibility, that's a very different dynamic as well. So, for example, in one setting, after I left JBWS, in another setting I was working in, the state standards were that anybody in a program to address their violence had to complete 52 sessions.
Mhm.
And now there are standards across most states in the United States to address interventions and such programs. But I recognized right away that, again, women were coming taking responsibility. So the justification was with the 52-week program was shaped around men's presentation in group and how long it took them to move from where they were to where they needed to be in that process of repair and moving forward. So through conversations with probation and with judges and others, asking through what I refer to as, radical curiosity, really showing up without judgment and to truly understand what a community partner is going through. What do you see when you see women on probation? What do you see when you see men on probation? And the same questions in the courtroom or a child protection hearing, whatever it may be. And my community partner said, you know what, again, women come and they're taking responsibility and they're also worried about how they can help their partner or their child's father or their former partner. So that socialization around caregiving, caretaking was coming out, as well as the socialization around you did something wrong and you're going to take responsibility. And they did right away. And of course, this isn't for everyone, but in general, that's what we saw happening.
Yeah.
And so it's very difficult in different states where there's one size fits all
Mm.
in intervention settings with men who've harmed their partners and women have as well.
Mhm.
And that's why I do a lot of work in Australia. And we came up with principles in both from the practice work we're doing and also the research. So rather than standards, principles of intervention that shape the work that we do, rather than a one size fits all.
Wow, I love this. And it's interesting because having this, like I said in the beginning, like a gendered kind of conversation, it's hard not to fall into pigeonholing people or saying all this stuff. But I think what you described is really interesting, and it's the difference in how people are socialized in
Yes.
regard to their gender and why that shows up differently, because you're right, like women do have that default, or they have been socialized to have that default of caretaking, and it's
Mhm.
interesting that it could translate into a taking accountability. So I really kind of appreciate you pointing out that piece. And I do want to get more into this problematic area that you refer to as like the victim offender binary.
Mhm.
And I want to really kind of talk about why that's so problematic and why we're kind of trying to avoid having such a rigid binary in that regard. Can you talk about that a bit?
Absolutely. It's a challenge because I think as human beings that well really we keep ourselves safe through categories.
So true.
We have an experience, we file it away somewhere. So when we have a similar experience, we think, oh, I know how to deal with this. I mean, crossing the street, if we had to go through if it was a new experience every single time, where would we be?
Terrified.
Right, right. So understanding that the early messaging of the battered women's movement was this idea of that every woman and that every woman can be harmed.
Right.
And there was not languaging around or messaging around who was doing the harm necessarily,
Mhm.
and the complex dynamics that way, and that those people also oftentimes had trauma histories.
Mhm.
And it led to, again, this idea of, and I think this was one of your questions as well, the lifetime victim.
Yeah.
One of the women in my book refers to if anyone's watched Lifetime television, there's a prescribed
Mhm.
storyline. And if it involves domestic violence, which the women in my work refer to it as domestic violence, others in intimate partner violence,
Right.
and abuse, that like the good or the deserving or the lifetime victim is one oftentimes portrayed as white, as passive, easy to work with, has a tear streaming down her cheek. Uh, but as human beings with survivorship histories, a lot of times that's just inaccurate. And particularly if we think of the experiences of low income folks, people of color, people living on the margins of society who are justifiably frustrated and angry with their circumstances. And the violence may not be the first thing that they're thinking of in terms of having to get through the day to take care of the children, whatever needs to be done. So when they show up for services or when the police get called and how the police may understand these dynamics or not, they oftentimes do not align with that good survivor or that lifetime victim trope. And so that is the difficulty that, again, it reinforces this binary. So, a real victim deserves services. And another problem and real challenge here is how we implicitly assess for risk in intervention settings. Oftentimes, the question is asked, are you afraid of your partner? And if the other person says yes, you think, okay, I've got this. I know where I'm going. So basically, you're asking someone to do a risk assessment for themselves.
Right.
And the yes goes in a certain direction of this kind of imaginary flow chart of resources, confidential support, onward. If someone says, no, I've got it, I could kick his ass in the language of some of the women I work with, think, oh, red flag, this person is an offender. Here we go. We're going to go in this other direction.
Wow.
Because the language of fear is very subjective. What I'm afraid of may be something very differently than what you're afraid of, or any
Yeah.
other person. And particularly when someone is living in a relationship with harm, with chaos, with abuse, it's very natural to have survival skills, defense mechanisms where we think, I've just got to get through the day. I don't have time to be afraid. I can handle this. I got to move forward. It does not mean that that person is not at significant risk of harm.
Mhm.
So that is another area of that binary. Are you afraid or aren't you? I recommend people take a deeper dive after asking about fear, ask about dread. Because what we're really asking about in these situations, we want to understand if people are being coercively controlled. And with coercive control, we know that oftentimes that doesn't involve violence at all. That is how someone has absolute domination and authority in that relationship to control another person that can take place over an extended period of time. And I'm saying person intentionally here because there are all different relationship experiences.
Yeah.
And in with coercive control, I think that's what we need to be talking about. The legal system shapes this binary. It also shapes what we think of as harm, oftentimes from an incident-based, physical, visibly physical, physically harmed person.
Right.
And that's a real challenge because it doesn't take any consideration for the hours, the days, the weeks, or the months before that event and who really controls the relationship dynamic. So she may be fighting back and he may not have laid a hand on her, but she also may be at a point where she can't take the course of control anymore and she's petrified for what's going to happen next if she doesn't fight back.
Mhm.
And I also, with how, describing intimate harm here as well, I want to point out that another binary can be created between it's either self-defense or it's this aggressive use of violence. And Dr. Susan Miller, she's at the University of Delaware. We've done a lot of work together. She wrote Victims as Offenders published in 2005. It was the first book on
Wow.
this issue. Yes, a fantastic book that I highly recommend. We went through the intake narratives of more than 200 women to understand their descriptions of what brought them to the attention of the legal system. We actually came up with 9 different themes, because we really wanted to understand and recognize through empirical research that, of course, there's not one or two kinds of reasons or descriptions that women would be arrested or use force.
Right.
It's much more complicated than that. So with those 9 themes, of course, they're not mutually exclusive. Of course, more work needs to be done, but it really gets the conversation started in a way that we can parse these out and understand what is happening and push beyond that binary, back to your original question.
Wow, you said a lot of really interesting things here. So I'm just going to back up a little bit. When you talk about coercive control, just for people who maybe aren't super familiar with domestic violence, can you describe coercive control a little bit more and how that maybe feeds more into the dread that you mentioned? You ask people, are you afraid? And they might say no, but do they dread things? So how does that play into coercive control and what is coercive control?
Mhm. Coercive control is the ability to exert and maintain long-term relationship domination and control. And Lisa Fontes, the University of Massachusetts, she has written a book on this. Evan Stark really popularized the term in his work. And it is very culturally specific. And by that, I mean, yes, the cultures of the people in the relationship, but when you are in a relationship with 2 people, you create your own culture. And if there is abuse there, there's a culture around that abuse. And what do I mean by that? I mean a situation, certain language that is used.
Fascinating.
And the coercive control keeps people, the person that's being harmed,
Mhm.
answering to the other person and very concerned about their well-being. And it's not, in my experience, I describe it in terms of the coercively controlling person has, again, that ability to maintain and exercise long-term relationship domination, but the person using force to try and break free of that is trying to have relationship autonomy. And it's more of a stop, I've had enough, but they don't have the ability to maintain that long-term relationship control. So when I talk about fear and then move on from to the dread, what you want to understand or what people want to understand about coercive control is who has the ability to who if that person, the other person is being monitored in the relationship. So for example, to go a bit deeper around the questions of dread, do you dread what your partner or child's parent or former partner can find out about you? Well, yes, I would be concerned that that person would find out that I was visiting my best friend from high school, and my partner doesn't like my best friend from high school. And every time I do, then my partner, rations food or becomes very quiet to me or won't let me talk to my son. Okay. So also, something else that could be found, the odometer on the car. And this is not something that happens instantly. It's something that happens overnight where the control builds and builds, and it can be very confusing in the beginning, particularly in teen dating relationships where things that are coded as very romantic or
Yeah.
loving. Oh, this other person is checking up, sending me 20 texts. I woke up and I had all these texts in the morning and it's so romantic. Or this person wants me to turn on my location services on my phone because they just are concerned about me and want to know where I am. Yes, those can be a romantic, wonderful thing to share between people, lots of texts and sharing your location services. But the question is that person safe if they turn their location services off? Is
Right.
that person safe if they don't return those text messages right away?
Mhm.
And that internal feeling of, oh, I get this stomach ache or my hands sweat or my back hurts because I'm just worried about what more is going to happen if I don't respond the way this other person wants me to respond. So that's what we need to be thinking about a coercive control. And I'm actually very concerned that it's growing in criminalization because I don't think that we certainly haven't been able to arrest our way out of domestic violence. And adding coercive control in, I believe what's going to happen is we'll just make the actual coercively controlling partner much more creative. I have an article that just came out recently called The Arrest Web, and it details the experiences of some of the women from my book, where four different threads that came together to ensnare the women and the police in the person who harmed them's web of power. And so this was really facilitated through police understanding of mandatory arrest. Oftentimes, in the case of these women, is a very patterned response across the women's arrest experiences. She often disclosed everything that had happened at the incident that she had done, but did not detail what he had done to her. Whereas when he was asked, he only talked about what she had done and did not detail what he had done to her. And so it then becomes this web where women are arrested, and many felt that they were safer once they got to the police car, and they
Mhm.
could then tell their full stories. But they didn't understand that if you get to the police car, you're already arrested, and it's too late to tell your full story. So that gives a bit more about coercive control and how we need to, again, this it's very challenging because the legal system is a significant aspect of many people's lives. And when people are being harmed and when there is a crisis and people need support, what options do they have? And police is one of the options that people use. But there can be a significant culture difference between what people think that they are going to get when they call the police and then what happens. And it's oftentimes based on their own assumptions around a law enforcement response.
Yeah, and to your point, I think mandatory arrest laws are something that people don't really understand or they don't really know what that means. So can you talk about that and how sometimes that can end up harming a victim or have some kind of consequences that maybe weren't originally intended when they were instated?
Mhm. Yes, it's mandatory, preferred, and pro arrest. There's a range of language to describe them, and they're really jurisdiction specific. So all across the US. So the original idea and hope was that, and again, out of concern and support for people who are police officers and wanting to do the right thing, wanting to end intimate harm, domestic violence. In the 70s, it was not, police would show up at an incident. They did not have any kind of institutional framework for what do we do. So
Right.
they'd show up and they'd say, okay, well, and remember, again, it was in this transition of a private family problem to a public crime. So maybe they were told to, he or she or they, whomever, was told to walk around the block, cool off, spend the night at your mom's house, whatever. There's a really um, in terms of historical documentation, amazing article that was written by some University of Michigan law school students in the 70s that talked about a stitch rule in one jurisdiction. And what was that? Police did not have any kind of framework for what they do when they arrive at a scene. And they did not, again, it wasn't in writing, there was not guidance that way. So, what this group of police officers did was that they would try to assess how many stitches they thought the person who'd been harmed needed.
No
And
way.
then, based on that, they would make an arrest and then support that other person going to the hospital. So we've come from a place where people did not know what to do to trying to provide guidance around that with mandatory preferred and pro-arrest laws. The idea that if there is a domestic violence incident and police arrive, they are tasked with identifying who harmed and who survived that harm. And it's not only in the police protocol, but it's also a large culture around how they understand that. So it's not necessarily in writing. What I'm saying is how the arrest is carried out.
Right.
And so again, it's going to depend upon the jurisdiction. It's going to depend upon the culture of that police force.
I think it also feeds into my next question, which is basically why, and this might be a loaded question, but
Yeah.
why does society kind of want or maybe knows more how to respond to somebody that's, to use your term and the term of the people that you interviewed, a lifetime victim, like somebody that doesn't fight back? What is it that kind of makes it so that they're almost less of a victim if they do fight back? Like what is the thought behind that? Why do people have almost a preference for a victim that is purely a victim, that's in air quotes, versus somebody that is going to fight back, or if their partner hits them, they're going to hit them back, like, and I'm not condoning that, but I'm just saying, like, what is that? Like, why does it land differently on people?
And I think that it's going to depend upon different communities and different cultures. And there can be, if we're thinking in the US setting where dominant white culture has ideas around appropriate femininity, I think it comes from that. But Dr. Hilary Potter wrote a book called Battle Cries, where she interviewed Black women about their resistance strategies and fighting back, and culturally very different portrayal of women. And also women's understanding of themselves. So I think that lifetime victim is really created around dominant culture and not taking a deeper dive to understand. Because if we're honest with each other, I mean, of course, women around the world have led revolutions. Women around the world are very capable of violence in many different settings. But when we bring it back to this context, to an intimate relationship where there's harm and who's causing the harm, what is the socialization that happens of those two individuals? And then what is the culture of that relationship? And then start to understand more deeply what's going on. And it's very difficult, I think, for practitioners in these settings to really be able to remove themselves from the legal system framing. I mean, even the language that we're using here, victim, offender, the
Yeah.
arrest, all of that, it's through the lens of a legal system framework. So
Mm.
if we can, of course, respect our legal systems partners and be doing our work and be respected for our work in removing that judgment and understanding when people come to systems attention for being harmed or causing harm or both experiences, where are they? How have their lives been shaped by the bodies they travel in and how institutions respond to them? That's where we're getting somewhere. And that is a necessary way to move beyond this victim offender binary is, and I write in my book too, in the last chapter, call to action for practitioners. We must be confident in the language that we are using. We must, to the best of our ability, refrain from using legal systems language. That's why the name of the book is Broken. The women that there's 33 women I spent 3 years learning from, 15 of whom had been in my groups years prior. These women did not talk about themselves as victims or offenders, as perpetrators or survivors. They talked about themselves as being or feeling broken. So that right there, how do people define themselves and their experiences, and understanding from their perspective what's best going to serve and meet their needs? And that's really complicated in a space that's oftentimes court ordered. And so recognizing that court order, but also that is the court and probation piece of it. What can happen in the intervention group that encourages healing and repair and truly understands a person from that person and environment perspective?
Man, you're brilliant. This is a really fascinating conversation. And it's interesting because I asked the community kind of some questions that they might have for you. People wonder, is it possible then for women to be abusive in the traditional sense that maybe a man is abusive? Maybe not exactly in the same exact way. We talked a little bit about, how battering was developed for men and coercive control is used predominantly by men, but is it possible for like a woman to be abusive? And I know once again that's feeding into stereotypes and gendered and getting away from the binary, but it is something that people in the community do wonder. Do you
Mhm.
have what would you say to that?
I think all of us can answer that question with, of course.
Yeah.
Of course it is. Yes. But in as answering applying general categories to people again is challenging. We're in this
Yes.
place where we're bringing context, but then have to have a conversation that doesn't last 20 hours, So,
Exactly.
so of course, I also want to know, as I would want to know for any person of any identity in that intervention group, I want to know what they've been through to bring them to that place that it felt like a good idea
Yeah.
to use whatever they used in that moment. And so, and that's part of the challenge in that work again, because when we think of that binary and how Emerge was that first program and battering intervention was the first intervention it was for men who harmed. Now, a lot of times the comparison is oftentimes, comparing women to men.
Mm.
And ideally, who are the people bringing it back to? Who are the people in the room? And what have you learned about those people? And also, what do you know about your own community?
Right.
Yeah, Vista was created at a certain place and time with a certain group of women in that group room over a course of years.
Mm.
Then that moved to Michigan, and now it's in China, across Australia, different parts of the world, across United States Air Force bases. That's why it's also a framework. I want practitioners to use their skills and expertise and understanding what am I seeing in the
Right.
presentation of the human being in front of me, both what they've been through and what they've done, and how can I best show up to walk alongside them in this journey of healing and repair, which will include both addressing the harm caused and the harm experienced.
Thank you, Dr. Young Larance, for taking the time to come on the podcast and talk about such an important issue. You've done amazing work in anti-violence intervention, and the women in JBWS's VISTA program have benefited from your pioneering efforts for years. Just as a reminder, Dr. Young Larance's book is linked in the show notes if you're interested in learning more. Thank you so much for listening to Unsilenced. These kinds of conversations are the first step in ending domestic violence. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unsilenced, Real Conversations About Abuse. This podcast is produced by JBWS, a domestic violence agency serving Morris County, New Jersey. Please let us know what topics you would like covered on this podcast by sending an email to podcast@jbws.org. Please note that this email address is only intended for content relating to the podcast. It is not meant to offer immediate assistance or access to services. If you live or work in Morris County and think you might be in an unhealthy relationship, JBWS is here to help. Please visit our website at jbws.org to learn more about our services or call our 24-hour helpline to speak to members of our staff at 1-877-782-2873. If you recognize controlling or abusive behaviors in yourself, JBWS can also help change those behaviors. Through our Jersey Center for Nonviolence, JBWS offers programs for men, women, and adolescent males who have used abusive or controlling behaviors in their relationships. Please visit jbws.org/JCNV or call 973-539-7801 to learn more. If you don't live in Morris County, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Domestic violence grows in silence, so thank you so much for listening and helping us break through that silence through these types of conversations. Please follow us on social media and continue to share our content to get as many people talking about domestic abuse as possible.